All information shared in this video is our educated opinion, formulated from research, judgment, analysis, education, and personal life experience. Any material used from the public domain follows fair use guidelines and applicable laws. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. This content is for education and entertainment. We encourage others to conduct proper research and, if needed, consult an attorney for legal advice regarding music licensing.
Hey, welcome everybody to another episode of SyncRiffs. Charles Levan here from Blue Buddha, joined by Chase Walker. How's it going, Chase?
Hey, it's going good. How you doing, man?
Doing good. Good to be back, and just some cool news to share before we start. For those of you who've been following us, really appreciate the support in the comments. We're now up on Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, and also Apple Music. So additional ways to follow the podcast and from week to week. And with that, this week we're going to unpack writing songs about life. So it's the third bucket. Previous, we talked about party songs, love songs, and then today, songs about life. What does that mean? So essentially, the homework one could do, so to speak, is when you're watching various shows, what comes out on the screen is themes that mirror what's happening in the world. So whether that might be inflation, wars, trials and tribulations, those types of thematic concepts in your works, in your songs, is what we're looking for pitches. Similarly, female empowerment songs. There's a lot of shows, a lot of briefs we get from time to time that on that topic matter. So, the best recommendation is what we talked about in other podcasts, is doing your homework of when you're watching a show or a film and you see a use of a given song, ask yourself, do I have a song in my catalog that I could have pitched for that scene? And if the answer is no, that's a huge opportunity to have a similar song in that lane with respect to the topic or the subject matter. Because, sometimes when you get briefs, or if we reach out to you and say, hey, you have a female empowerment song or a song about trials and tribulations, I lost my job, there's inflation, tough times. And if you don't have that song in your catalog, that's, an opportunity to have that for future pitches. So I guess, as far as inspiration goes, the day-to-day of what's happening in one's life, what's happening in the world, those themes about life can come into play. Chase, yourself as a songwriter, songs about life, you want to touch on a couple of your songs that I know as we've been working together, you wrote some songs that fall in that trials and tribulations lane?
Yeah, well, it's kind of when it comes to songs about life as opposed to songs about love or party or loss or death, it's sort of it's a bit of a niche lane somewhat in that regard, because it's speaking to something that for most people is very ordinary, but you as an artist are able to bring it out in a very emotionally descriptive kind of way. And so, that can be things like, just struggling to pay the bills. It could just be the monotony of life, you know what I mean? Or it could be an accomplishment. It could be, having I don't know, like just having worked out, you know what I mean? And you're feeling like pumped up, you know what I mean? Um, there's when you think about the kinds of scenes and the kinds of things that characters in films and TV shows go through, there needs to be a song on the soundtrack for every single one of those.
Yeah. And I think to your point, those songs that stand at the test of time, I go back to the hip hop days. I think the title of the track by Run DMC, Hard Times, talking about inflation, struggling to pay the bills. When that track was written back in the 80s, the big recession back then. And that song's timeless. And all the points that they rapped in that track is still cogent today, and depending on the scene of what the super's trying to sync to picture. So yeah, that's a great, the through line there is, I think we've mentioned in other podcasts, is making it relatable, being not too specific, but being general enough, and keeping in mind of, when you look at a show, who are the characters, the protag and the antagonist, what are they up against? What are the challenges? And, how is the music going to be the third character in the storytelling? So that palette of songs and the storytelling and the lyrics and the emotion that's created is what helps shape the narrative of the scene of the show. And therein lies the challenge, because as a songwriter, as you know, Chase, for every song you write, it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. And matching the lyrics with the arrangement, then sending it off and hoping it syncs to picture. All you can do is try and check off all those boxes. And I think a good through line, a question that we often get is, working with co-writers or producers, the team that's with you in the room. You can be a vocalist, you can have the best voice, but with songwriting, that may not be your strong suit. So doing a collab with a co-writer, because it's interesting, if you look at some of the hit songs, and if you go on the ASCAP or BMI, you'll see there was a team, 5, 6, 7, 8 writers sometimes, that contributed to that hit song. And that's for a reason. It wasn't just the sole songwriter, singer that came and crafted that huge track that with Billboard 100, played on radio, got synced up. So
that's how they like to advertise it.
Yeah.
But it's definitely, it takes a team of people and people who are, who know what they're doing when it comes to songwriting, not just very inspired writers, but like writers who have that understanding of the craft of what goes into making a song express what it's trying to express.
Yeah, I think, were there any, some of the feedback, because when you went and auditioned and you with it was The Voice?
Yeah.
Were there any? Yeah, go ahead.
I didn't really get to play much of my own original music during my experience there. I do remember there was a clause in the agreement for being on the show that, like, if any original music got created, that it was like automatically property of Universal Pictures or Universal Records. You know what I mean? But yeah, I mean, with something like that, your goal is in like a competition show like that. Your goal is really, how can I make a cohesive visual and audible, or visual and sonic brand, basically? How can I make myself into something that's identifiable to the audience? Like, oh, that's the guy that does X, Y, and Z kind of music, where it's not ambiguous. And the same is true when you're making music for Sync, because at the end of the day, music supervisors get way more music than probably anyone, both including either of us or anyone listening to this podcast, ever listens to, probably in the span of a month. And they have to go through that music. And if your sonic and visual brand is not identifiable with at least a few key things, it's going to be very hard for your music to come up in the back of that supervisor's mind when there's a placement that's right for it.
Yeah, no, and I think to your point with it's, whether it's American Idol, The Voice, if you look at the big money maker, obviously is identifiable songs, and the artists tend to cover tunes. So it's a hit, Frank Sinatra or Peggy Lee, who it might be, and then the publishing companies, that's a revenue stream on the performance income. And like you said, if an artist covers a huge track, and then it resonates with the listeners and the audience. But just to touch on what you said, Chase, I think that's a huge point. I was reading a book from a music super that was talking about, one of sort of the catch-22 once they got the gig, music from their inbox, physical CDs, people giving them music on, they recognize them and on the street, hey, check out my track. So, it's one of those things that whether it's an agent or a supervisor is respecting, they get so much music, we get so much music, and then that's one half of the equation, the clearing a track for sync. And that's actually a good segue to sort of recap, and we'll work into it, is some questions that we received online. But going back to our first podcast, Sync 101, 2 sides to a song, and the master and the publishing. So it's a song's an intellectual property. So if an independent artist, you create your own track, you're independent, you own your master and your publishing. So that's what we call one-stop representation. That's what we do, our wheelhouse, if you will, for Blue Buddha, working with one-stop indie artists. So, and with that though, is if there are co-writers, making sure you have your split sheets, everyone is identified on that, who owns what portion share of the writing and the publishing. And that's a question that we often get, is when you work with an agent or Blue Buddha, what do we need to hit the ground running? So spending a couple minutes there to make sure, so when we get your songs, your wave files, your vocal and your instrumental mix, the most important thing that we talked about is your metadata, everything that breaks down the year of release, the writer and publishing information. And we talked about in a mini course that we had the other day is if you do have a bunch of co-writes, is having a doc, an agreement that you can administer the rights on behalf of your co-writers for sync. And why we like that is then, hey, we can just do one phone call to the lead singer. We don't have to call 5 co-writers, and we know everyone's on board, and it's expedient. So as an agent, we have the confidence when we pitch your song.
Basically, yeah, there's when it comes to intellectual property in the form of a song, you have two forms of that, which is the song itself and the recording of the song. the actual composition of the song, like the lyrics, the chord progression, if you were to write the song out in actual notation, that is what's called the publishing of the composition. For the recording, it's considered the master, right? And for all intents and purposes, those can both be looked at kind of in the same degree of liability when it comes to the ownership, because essentially, if you write a song with someone and you don't have any agreement specifying who owns what or who controls what, basically it's by statute, it is considered that both of you own 100% of that song. So no party can go out and license that material without the permission of all parties involved, essentially, unless another agreement has been established that allows one specific person to do that. Now, the same is true when it comes to the recording as well. If you haven't made an agreement with the producer that you're working with the musicians that you're working with, that specifies that you are the sole administrator of this work or the sole owner of this work, and so let's say you haven't paid anyone out, it was just kind of like a pro bono thing, technically speaking, they could come back and come after some of those royalties, because by statute, you guys worked on this together, you're collaborators in this, and you both own it, unless one of the parties is paid out, essentially. And so what our master administration agreement does, or it's a master and publishing administration agreement, is it essentially specifies that one of the parties involved is going to be, whether or not they are the sole owner of that work, they are going to be the sole administrator, so that later on down the line, when opportunities arise for that material, basically the administrator can approve the license or whatever revenue opportunity it may be on behalf of everyone else, so that nothing gets held up. No one can come back later and say, oh, you can't do that. Well, they were given the right in the first place by signing that agreement. They were the ones who could say yes.
Yeah, and also to thread that needle, in addition to approving it, also we would pay that artist, and then in turn they pay out their co-writers. So we like that because it streamlines things for us, and that's important with making sure everyone's on board. Hey, we're going to do one check to the lead singer, and then turn we'll get our cut from them. They're not going to come back to Blue Buddha. And then the second point, just to bring up what you touched on also, is with, when you register your tracks, this is actually a good segue to questions that we received. So if you have a co-writer, say Chase and I did a track, I'm with ASCAP, Chase is with BMI. So each of us on our own, we would register our portion of the song, our writing and publishing share, with our PRO. And our recommendation, it's best to do that ahead of time. So by the time you hand us your assets, we can pitch your songs, hit the ground running, and everything's been registered, buttoned up. So when we land the placement, you're not playing catch up to register your songs. So with that, I'll pull up some other questions. One other question that we had received is with respect to instrumental mixes, someone asked, do we need the stems of the instros? And the answer is no. For TV productions and film, what we need is the full instrumental of the full arrangement.
Basically the full mix minus the vocal.
Correct. Well said. Yeah, stems would be if that was for a trailer. But what Chase said, that's spot on. And That was a question, and I'm just going to pull up. I think, Chase, what was another question that we had? Let's see here.
Well, just to clarify on the instrumental point, I think part of that question too had to do with like what is the rationale behind like why they need the instrumentals.
Sure.
For the most part, it's in situations where if the song is required to go underneath dialogue, then they may need to create a version of your mix where the vocals are mixed down. And so to do that, they basically lay the instrumental mix over the top of the full mix. And so by what's the term I'm looking for? Basically, by it cancels out the level of the vocal. It's like you're turning everything else up and keeping the vocal where it's at.
Yeah, no, 100%. Because that's in those cases where there's a scene and the actor's dialogue is competing with your vocal tracks, and then that is the remedy. So that's a good point there. And then someone had asked, do artists ever create alternate mixes for pitching to sync? And my recommendation there, is you craft your that single version. Because if you have alternate mixes and we're pitching both, that can create some confusion there. So having one version, unless of course if it's a remix that completely flips the track and it's a different style, a remix would be something else. But alternate mixes, less so. And
you definitely want to register, especially if you're doing an alternate mix or even a remix. You want to have those registered as two separate songs, correct?
Yeah, correct.
Typically, yeah,
it would be. So you're saying for remix, would you re-register that?
Yeah, potentially. Well, I guess it depends on if you're working with a different group of producers or what it might be. But depending on the situation, you might want to have another registration for that to keep track of which version is receiving what revenue, essentially.
Yes, I get what you're saying. Yeah, and that's a fair point. Definitely. So similarly, earlier to your point, Chase, something that came into my mind is the concept of work for hire. So say, Chase, you wrote a track. It's 100% Chase Walker. You're the writer and the publisher, but you hire a vocalist to sing on that track. You pay that vocalist her time to record that track. So that's called work for hire. She doesn't own anything on the writer or the publishing share. So sometimes you'll see, XYZ track featuring blah, blah vocalist. And then we'll pose that question and we'll look at the writer pub info. But work for hire is a perfect example where that vocalist, they were paid out for their time and singing on that track. They don't have any sync approval rights because then they're not a co-writer or publisher on the track.
Correct. Yeah. Well, and depending on how you want to do it, because some artists, they want to make sure that like all the musicians on the record are getting paid something, you know what I mean? But in those situations, if you do have people, especially on the master, if you're splitting it with someone, you definitely want to have that admin agreement because no one wants to go to 3 different parties to clear a master, especially when they're already having to do that on the publishing,
Yeah, right. Exactly. And back to, a word that they're expedient, less hoops, less phone calls. And then it's more, because that's what, there's a distinction. Sometimes folks will label their tracks as one-stop rep and then easy clear. So if you see the word easy clear, well, what does that mean? There's, it's not one-stop rep. There's a differentiation there. And it's subjective. What someone might be like, yeah, it's my friend. I only have to do 2 other calls, but it's easy to clear, but there's some other entanglements, and that's and the benefit of what having the admin doc pre-signed, everyone's on board. And this is actually a great segue, a question that we received from on YouTube. It says, when it comes to pitching, I think this is from Ivy. It says, when it comes to pitching, do one-stop songs usually take precedent due to ease of clearing? I have a mix of both one-stop and easy clear material. With the easy clear material, I collaborated with one other songwriter. I have no publisher, but he has a publisher. Split is 50-50 for the composition, and I own 100% of the masters. So before we get into the weeds, so to speak, of creatively, if I'm a music soup and I get 2 tracks, one says one stop rep, one's easy clear, creatively, if it fits, the cue or the scene, then the music super is going to look at both and say, well, which fits creatively? So I guess her question is, if they get a bunch of cues, that's one stop rep, are they going to listen to those first? I mean, it depends on, factors. One stop rep, they know it's going to be indie budget. When they see easy clear, what I was saying before, sometimes like, well, what does that mean? They got to read extra lines of, oh, there's a co-writer, but that person is administered. So easy clear, the interpretation, depending on one's deadline, they may sidestep that and go to the one-stop rep. But again, if it fits creatively, the music soups is going to get in the trenches, so to speak, to clear that track because it fits. Anything you might want to add there, Chase? I might have left out.
Yeah, just to book in that, it's all like you're saying. It's the first priority is, does it actually work for the scene? Because they're not going to prioritize a one-stop track that doesn't really work as well for the scene over an easy clear track that's perfect for the scene, because it's all about, how can you make the scene as compelling as possible? That's their whole job. But assuming you have 2 tracks that are kind of a toss-up, they could both work for the scene. One of them's one stop, one of them's easy clear. They're probably going to go for that one stop because they have a million other things to be doing, and they don't, if there's some way that they can save themselves some time, they're going to do it, But again, it all has to tie back to, is it the right song?
Yeah, no, and that's, looking at some recent placements, like you said, Chase, is if it's, why create more work when if it's just, we know we can just plug and play one-stop reps. We don't have to renegotiate the budget. It's one phone call. And so path of least resistance, if you will. And that's, another point that we talked about, same with the music libraries. A lot of supers, they have their go-to music libraries. They know the cues are going to work for a background instrumental. It may be a short use, a transition scene, so they can plug and play those tracks. They have those relationships with the libraries for years, and they spend minimal time on that and on to the next. Because I think a good segue or tying that in is, the montage scenes, or when they do have budget for bigger artists, that's the bulk of their time is clearing those tracks. Because if it's, Harry Styles, Lizzo, there's a bunch of writers, co-writers, publishers. You got to clear or contact all those companies to clear their share and their portion of the writing and the publishing. That can take an inordinate amount of time. There's no guarantee they're going to clear it with the budget that super needs to clear it on, and then they may have to go back to the drawing board and find an alternate track. on deadline. So you factor that in, and multiple times if a super's working on more than one show and say one episode has 20 songs, you do the time and the math that you're putting into clearance. Creative is one side. The other coin is clearing it on time, on budget, and then balancing. You've got the needs of the studio, the creatives, everyone in the room who wants the best song and the best creative for the show. So, and then you factor in who they're going to. They have their label reps, their managers, their sync agents that they can get content from, and things have to be expedient, meet the deadlines, and meet the budget. So with that, those were just some of the questions that we wanted to address, and keep posting those questions. We love getting the feedback, and thank you guys for your support. From week to week, we'll share these questions, and we'll catch you on the other side. Namaste, and thank you, and smash that notification bell, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Namaste.